You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 23rd of January 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from the World Economic Forum here in Davos. I'm Carlota, Rebelo. Coming up on today's program.
The migration of the political debate from the institutions, newspapers and coffee shops to social media is making us replace rigor for immediacy and complexity with brevity.
Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez goes after social media moguls for destroying democracy. Also ahead, with Donald Trump's presidency well underway, we'll assess what impact his policies might have in global trade. Plus, we meet the company helping leaders find their purpose, talk about Switzerland's hosting power, and our team brings us the latest from the Promenade. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Carlota Rebelo, live from Davos. Welcome to a special edition of The Briefing, live from Davos. I'm Carlota Rebelo. It's day 4 of the World Economic Forum's annual meeting and the de facto end of proceedings, as many of the global leaders and CEOs start to leave town later today. All eyes are set on US President Donald Trump's speech later this afternoon and how Europe might react to it. Well, let's unpack all of this and what else has been marking the agenda with Sarah Wheaton, who's the Chief Policy Correspondent for Politico Europe and the host of Politico's EU Confidential podcast. Hi, Sarah. Thank you for joining us in the studio.
Carlota, thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's start exactly by addressing some of the rumors that have been flying around, I guess, since yesterday, that Donald Trump might be here in person. The program still says it's a virtual address, but as keen spotters will have seen an increase in security presence today. So that hasn't helped put the rumors to rest. What have you been hearing?
I mean, we haven't heard word yet that Air Force One has taken off from Washington. So,
and as far as we know, the Concorde has not made a comeback. So it starts to become very unlikely.
Yes. But I mean, Trump loves to be unpredictable and he's the ultimate showman. So, never rule anything out.
What are you expecting for us to get from his speech? Of course, it is a guessing game and what everyone is looking out for. He has made some strong comments ever since, his inauguration. It's just been a couple of days that already feel like a couple of weeks. What are you expecting for us to hear?
Again, he loves to be unpredictable, but it's notable that it's kind of finance. It's not really going to be fully a speech. It's going to be like a Q&A with finance titans. On the one hand, these are Trump's people from way back in the day when he was a New York real estate mogul. On the other hand, Davos is the ultimate establishment place, the ultimate globalist elite place. And so I'm sure he's going to find some ways to punch everybody here in the face.
And of course, the tech moguls surrounding Trump seems to be the new reality and the de facto government of the United States, or at least having a close ear to the president. And of course, there's been questions about how Europe is going to react to what this renewed tech presence might mean and what that means for Europe itself. What are some of the concerns here? And are we hearing anything that puts a bit of confidence into the bloc?
Yeah, I mean, the bloc has been struggling to respond. So we were really paying attention at Politico Europe to 2 speeches from European leaders this week. The first was Ursula von der Leyen's speech to kind of open the World Economic Forum on Tuesday. And she was walking a very tight line, basically trying to make the argument to Trump that the U.S. needs Europe, that we can make a deal together and mutually benefit. Also trying to needle him a little bit, basically saying quality of life is better in Europe. I'm not sure that's going to go over so well. On the other hand, we heard Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez really just go after not Trump, but Trump's allies head on by attacking social media moguls. He basically said that these billionaires are out to destroy democracy. And he said that Europe should take strong measures to go against them, whether that's changing the rules to keep people from being anonymous on social media, to actually applying stiff fines and holding holding the owners of these tech companies personally responsible for potential harms that they cause. We'll see how that goes over with the rest of the bloc.
It's been interesting to see the reaction from Sanchez's speech, because for many it was a bit unexpected. He, of course, even though it wasn't direct, making references of make social media great again and mentioning, the tech sort of oligarchy coming up, it is clear who he's referencing to. It was a message to one person and one person only, wasn't it?
Maybe 4 or 5, but yeah, mainly Elon Musk, I think is fair to say. And Europe, we are waiting to hear the results of a probe into X that Europe has done. It's the first probe under Europe's kind of landmark Digital Services Act. And again, it's unclear if Europe will actually punish them, and if they will, if they do choose to punish X, whether they will actually charge a high enough fine that the company feels compelled to make changes.
Do you think it will be, how will it be for Europe, in fact, to implement any sort of regulations on tech now that we have this power battle coming from Washington?
It's going to be difficult because, Musk is basically a high-ranking Trump official. So in addition to just kind of the corporate issues, you might sort of essentially cause a diplomatic spat. Also, more broadly, Europe has been having this reckoning with its sinking economy. It's still the second biggest economy in the world, but its share relative to the U.S. as well as China is really sinking. And the tech CEOs that I've been talking to here love to complain that Europe regulates before it innovates. And I think they're really feeling like some vindication in this moment. On the other hand, I think what we heard, especially from Sanchez and to a lesser extent from von der Leyen, like Europeans are really, at least the mainstream in Europe, is really proud of their tech regulations, and they see themselves as protecting citizens from these unknown technologies that could cause harm, that could undermine democracy. And it will really be a moment of reckoning for Brussels to see if they want to kind of play nice with Trump, get him to do what they want on trade, on continuing to support Ukraine, or if they really want to say we're going to be a global leader on enforcing privacy and democratic values on the tech sphere.
Now, Sarah, you'll be heading back to Brussels once Davos wraps up. What are you bringing back with you? I mean, there's still a couple of hours left today, and there's all of tomorrow left. But it's been an interesting edition. So I'm keen to hear from you. What have been your key takeaways that you're taking to Brussels back with you?
Yeah, I mean, a bit what I was saying about Europe being paralyzed. They're just waiting to see what happens. So everybody, I'm hearing a lot of optimism from Trump's tweet or Truth Social post yesterday saying to Putin, hey, it's time to make a deal on Ukraine. You can do it the easy way or the hard way. And if you don't come to the table, I'm going to impose more sanctions on you. That has really actually cheered people up a lot. But the question is, how far will Trump actually push Putin? And the other question that really came up at a discussion I was at this morning with some top European foreign ministers, the president of the parliament, is will Europe actually have a seat at the table, even if the US and Russia and Ukraine come? Like, what is the motivation for including European countries, for including Brussels? Their argument is, look, it's going to be up to us to potentially send peacekeeping troops, enforce the peace. So you need to have us there. But who knows whether Trump will find. It's up to Trump if they're there, basically.
Well, we shall, of course, keep an eye and see how it develops. And if the rumors are true, we are hearing a helicopter. So we'll see what that means. Sarah Wheaton from Politico Europe, a pleasure. Thank you for joining us on The Briefing, live from Davos.
Thank you.
As it's been evident over the past couple of days, the start of Donald Trump's second presidency has overshadowed many of the conversations happening here in Davos. One of them is about what impact his policies might have in global trade and investment. So what are the biggest challenges emerging economies are facing now that Trump is president again? Well, joining me here in our Davos studio is Erik Berglof, who's the chief economist of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Erik, welcome to The Briefing. Let's start precisely with that question. What are the the biggest challenges faced by emerging economies under Trump 2.0?
Well, I think there are a lot of issues that emerging economies are still recovering from related to COVID. So on top of that now comes trade wars that are, they are going to be kind of collateral damage to these battles. And there's a lot that they need right now. They need access to capital, they need access to technologies, they need to do a lot of this remaining transition towards net zero. And of course, the whole net zero momentum gets a big challenge from what the new administration is proposing.
So how can these economies better be helped? Can international organizations step up? What are some of the ways to provide that support?
No, I think that's exactly what we have to think about, and how we do this on a scale that's sufficient to meet the needs, and to do it. Sometimes we have to work country by country and think about how can we best work together. There's a lot of pressure now to co-finance between different multilateral development banks, connecting also to national development banks, bringing in the private sector. All that needs to happen on a scale that we haven't managed to so far.
Do you feel like changes are needed to make development banks work better?
Yes, but I think actually a lot has happened in the last 3 or 4 years, and there's been a kind of under the radar changes in these banks, reflecting the fact that we were set up with very risk-averse rules of engagement, and now we have much more evidence on what happens to loans from multilateral development banks, for example, when they get run into trouble. And so we have much better evidence to show that we actually, this is what we call the preferred creditor status, which is a kind of privilege of these MDB, which also is a reason why they are so helpful for these countries to be able to lend and know that we can come back in with more financing later on because we are protected. We know now that what the value of that is, and that has been a part of a sort of G20-driven process that has really changed. For every institution, it has allowed us to increase how much we can lend to countries. And particularly for a new institution like ours, we don't have a lot of credit histories to point to, so we have been able to increase what we can do, particularly for poorer countries and countries with greater risk. And I think that's where much of the needs are, and we need to think about how can we go even further.
And often when we have these conversations, the issue about transparency always comes up. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the ways you think that can be improved and, to make things more transparent?
Yeah. So I think there is actually one single measure. It's not a single measure, but it's a single approach that could really help with transparency. We call it country platforms. It sounds very bureaucratic, but it actually is. It's quite impactful, and in a way, it's to think about how the whole international system interacts and coordinates in a particular country. So I can give you an example. In Egypt, for example, they launched their own country platform. They put up all the renewable projects in wind and solar over the next 10 years. They said to all their international development partners and to the private sector, say, here is what we want to do over the next 10 years. How can you work together to achieve those? And then they managed also, along with that, to have a plan for decommissioning fossil fuel-related assets. Brazil, during its G20 presidency, really pushed this agenda. They brought together all the different tracks of the G20 process to work on climate action and make these country platforms a centerpiece. And then they developed their own country platform, which I think is the state of the art now. And that is, I think, a very positive development. And the idea behind the country platforms is to create transparency and also to sort of agree on a set of standards, because it's once you start agreeing on these standards and mutual agreement among the MDBs and with the national development institutions, that's when we can start thinking about could we maybe offload some of this in the financial markets. So it's not only transparency is helpful for avoiding corruption and maybe make it easy to collaborate, but it also then easier to find ways of bringing the private sector and putting assets out in the market, because if it's transparent, if the rules are the same, we can bunch assets together and put them out there. So country platform sounds kind of off-putting, but it actually is a very powerful mechanism. Yeah.
And what you were just describing brings me to one of the other topics, which is this idea of planetary health. And this is linking climate, nature, and human health. Tell me a bit about that and why it is so important.
For us, at least, it's about climate, it's about nature, and it's about health, for human health. We know that climate and nature, we are losing nature because of heating and so on, and nature can help to, for example, absorb CO2 and so on. So that's a very close relationship. We're also starting to understand much better how climate change affects human health, and there's a lot of evidence, and of course, particularly in the emerging and developed world, where you don't have so many protections. I mean, this is one thing that is sort of obvious when you think about it, but when you look at the data, for advanced economies, rich economies, air pollution and heat and so on is much less of a problem because there is enough resources to do whatever you need yourself. You have air purifiers, you have air conditioning and so on. So all those risks that come in countries with less resources are much more important. We know that these things in nature and having healthy ecosystems have also very important health impacts. And particularly for a bank that, we do infrastructure and we can do health infrastructure, but we know actually that the healthcare sector only accounts for 10% of the health outcomes. Environment is about 3 times as much, and we need to think about how can we, as an infrastructure bank, be part of through what we do on transport, what we do on energy, what we do on water, what we do in the digital space. How can we help improve health outcomes? Last year our report, and I was very happy to talk about it on your show, was on nature as infrastructure and thinking about nature as something that we have to invest in, we have to manage, we have to make it more resilient. And here you can see the connection that we are a bank that looks at nature as our most prescient and most important infrastructure for sustaining life on Earth. If we have that approach, we can also much more directly intervene to try to think about how can we affect health outcomes. So while combining health with climate and nature, we are both justifying getting more resources into health because there's a lot of climate finance, increasing nature finance. Let's use some of that for health. And improve health outcomes. It's a very complex package, planetary health, but it's something that I think will increasingly resonate with people.
Erik Berglof of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, thank you. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio, live from Davos. You're back with a special edition of The Briefing on Monocle Radio, live from Davos. Now, with all eyes set on Switzerland this week, this is a great opportunity for Team Swiss to flex its hosting and diplomatic muscles. Here in Davos, it's not just about the Congress Center, but also House of Switzerland, which is once again bringing together under one roof the Swiss delegation, international guests, partners, and of course, the media for the World Economic Forum. To give us a sense of how it has been is, of course, Alexandre Edelmann, a familiar voice for Monocle listeners and the head of Presence Switzerland. Hello, Alexandre.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for joining us in our studio. It's great to see you again. I feel like it has become a staple of Thursdays in Davos that we speak to you. Sorry. Is it because it starts to wind down?
No, we can sign up for that for the next 10 years.
I'm down with that. Now, of course, we wanted to speak to you about, the role that Switzerland has this week in being this facilitator of global conversations. That's happening both inside the Congress Center, in the House of Switzerland. What can you share with us?
Usually when I introduce panels on stage at the House of Switzerland, we have 2 events venue. We had about 15 panels this week. I usually say Davos or the WEF is what you make out of it. And I think this is it can be shiny or it can be useful, it can be both. And I think we're fostering the dialogue at the House of Switzerland in order to be not only shiny, and it's part of the game. When you see all the brilliant people attending Davos, of course, there's a shiny side of it. You attended one panel this morning when you have Prime Minister from Bhutan. He's not shiny, he's just like charismatic, and he brings the light on him. And I think this is, for us, the key is how do we contribute. I won't use the word better world today. I think it has been overused this week. But nonetheless, deeply, how do we contribute to that discussion? This is a key value for Switzerland, being an honest broker, being undangerous enough to be trusted, being stable enough to be trusted too. So I think the House of Switzerland is in connection with these values and the ambition of being a platform when people can still talk together.
And of course, there is the element of, I guess, the Geneva element as well, of the amount of international organizations based in Geneva that use as well this week to meet international partners. So it's not just about, making new connections, but for many, this is the one time of the year that you can gather people from all sides of the world together.
Yeah, this is our president said it this morning. She had a press conference, kind of a wrap-up of the week, and she said, of course, we're talking all year long, but this is the moment we all meet at the same place at the same time. And I think it's not useless to talk. It's not realistic to meet every month everywhere in the world. So at least the Davos is that moment where all the people that are already connected indeed, not all of them, but most of them, they know who they are and so on, to meet in kind of a protected area. It's set up a bit the tone of the year. And of course, this week, knowing what's happening in Washington, it was a special one. This is, for everybody, that was the elephant in the room, the arrival of the new president in Washington. And that shows also the importance of people to talk together to that special moment.
Well, indeed, even on Monday, as we've discussed here before, the entire town became a watch party. There was no room that you couldn't turn and have the inauguration on a screen, followed by a cocktail reception, which might be very much needed. But let's turn back to the focus of your presence here this year. What have been... For you, we have this theme of collaboration in the intelligent age, and that has permeated all the outside panels as well. How has that reflected in the conversations happening at House of Switzerland, and perhaps some of the conversations you yourself have been having with your counterparts?
I would say the theme is broad enough that you can connect many things to it, and this is a talent of the WEF. I'm not criticizing it. It has to be broad enough that for everybody to find oneself in it. For us, today we had that panel at 8 in the morning about Baukultur Alliance, which is a joint venture between Switzerland and the WEF. Then we had the signature of a free trade agreement between Thailand and the EFTA countries happening in the same house within 1 hour. Then we have a discussion today with Polish ministers coming there. So it's really, we do indeed collaborate a lot. And Switzerland it's part of the DNA. We have to. So it has always been part of the DNA of the country. We are small enough to be agile, to use the keyword, but also we are small enough to need to collaborate. So we're really standing for that, to open collaboration with as many countries as possible. And this is happening. When I listen to the panels happening at the House, you do feel that most people are willing to collaborate and also are aware that it's a need. So in that sense, this year, but it's not only this year, but of course this year it matches with the theme of the WEF.
And that idea of Switzerland being, a place that convenes global minds is not just during WEF. We had last year that global conference that was set on Ukraine and bringing peace to Ukraine, which was highly important. And this year, perhaps even more important for Monocle listeners, is you'll have Eurovision later in the year. And I had to sneak this one in while I have you in front of me in the studio. Now, will that be a great convener of minds for you as well?
But it's interesting when you look at, we're measuring the image of Switzerland on a daily basis, inclusive in the media, social media, and so on. Half of the world thinks it's great news, the other half thinks it's a shame. So it's interesting. So it's difficult to answer to you if it's good or bad. So, first of all, congrats to Nemo, who won last year. He has a wonderful echo abroad, and having ESC, so Eurosong contest in Switzerland. I just got yesterday my invitation for the visit of the pre-show. I'm not invited to the show, but nonetheless, I will have sneak a peek. I think it's something happening. You have thousands of media covering it, people talking about it, so it's good for Switzerland. It's a very loved TV show. I won't state about that on my personal question, but it's part of everybody's history. So in that sense, having them back in Switzerland 40 years later, I think it's great. It's a great visibility for Switzerland anyway.
And just showing how much those diplomatic and hosting muscles can be flexed, both for here at Davos and then, of course, more culturally with Eurovision. Alexandre Edelmann, a pleasure as always to have you here on The Briefing, live from Davos. Now, over 1,600 business leaders, including over 900 of the world's top CEOs and chairs, are here in Davos this week for the World Economic Forum. Many will have a clear vision for what's ahead, but some might need just a little extra help. The Beautiful Truth is a group that is dedicated to helping organizations and businesses to better understand and express their values. So, how can a business be both a force for good and profitable at the same time? And what are the challenges that business leaders face in their communications? To find out how they are helping leaders find their purpose, I'm now joined by Adam Penny, the co-founder and CEO of The Beautiful Truth, and by Claudia Biçen, the brand's chief experience designer. Welcome both to the briefing. Adam, let's start with you. Where did The Beautiful Truth's journey begin?
So we started way back in 2002 as a documentary company and kind of evolved from there. And I guess where we are today is really, we asked this question about, well, what should a business be at this point in our history? What's a business for? How does it serve a community, not just the community on the social side, but the community of employees that it's part of as well? And we think that by answering that question and coming up with a myriad of answers, so we work on things to do with human rights, sustainability, employee engagement, mental health. If we can start answering those questions in different ways, then we start making different choices. And if we make different choices, we can impact the world in a different way.
Now, one of the things that defines your work as well is this idea of defining purpose in leadership, which seems quite fitting for the week that we are in and our setting. How do you define purpose in leadership?
So it's a really interesting time, as you said, for purpose. You know, I think there was an article in the FT only last week that was saying, has corporate purpose lost its purpose? And I think that's a fair point. You know, when purpose is something that is pasted on either as a slogan for a marketing department or is something that's mandatory if you're listed on the London Stock Exchange, then it becomes very difficult for that to be something that's about your true intentions. For us, purpose is also about meaning. What meaning do we derive from the work that we do? And if we understand the meaning that is beyond ourselves, that's really where we start talking about purpose in a different way. So for us, it's something that's really about those intentions, those inherent motivations, those things that aren't necessarily that easy to quantify. But when you understand them and when you start to talk to people on that level, then you have a completely different conversation. And that's one of the things we try and do with business.
Claudia, let's bring you into this conversation because I'm really curious to continue on this idea of, finding purpose. So what are some of the ways that, the company goes about helping businesses find, first of all, and then share their purpose?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, to answer also what you were saying before about how do we think about purpose? For me, purpose is really finding that alignment between what are the skills and the offerings and the strengths that we have as an organization and where do they fit a need in the world? And I think there's been obviously historically a big focus on what are our offerings and less what is the need in the world that we're serving. And that's where purpose comes from, is focusing on how that organization is interconnected with a much, much vaster network of stakeholders rather than just centering the sort of immediate self of the organization. And that's really for me, that's really the starting point, is what is your story of that connection to the need that you're serving in the world? Why does that matter? Who does it matter to? And how do we make sure that all of the operations and all of the people in the organization are keeping an eye on that larger story of which we are a part of, decentering self, or perhaps expanding self within the organization to mean self that is the immediate organization, the leaders, but also the larger network of stakeholders that it's part of.
Well, and speaking of leaders, I'm curious to hear your take on what is the thing that you think leaders most misunderstand about finding a purpose or the importance of having a clear purpose?
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question. If I think about the conversations that we have, people either start talking about whether it needs to be purpose or profit, and it really needs to be both. And I think one of the things that we challenge ourselves with our clients through our magazine is to see how these two things coexist. And obviously, it's an interesting week, obviously with Trump taking power as well, with the real dominance of business and that seems to be taking place in the US. To really ask that question again, what is a business for? And if we're saying that a business is there just to make money, is a very narrow is a very narrow view of what a business is for, then what is that money for? That money is there to serve a certain community. But a business is, without getting too esoteric, a business is about the community. Business is about the meaning we derive from our life. Business is about the communities that we are part of, that are formed around that business, whether you're a customer or whether you work within an organization. So it's a meaning-making entity. It's not just a profit-making entity.
And of course, here we're talking about, we've been talking about the importance of a business or a company or leaders having a clear purpose. But then if we're talking about a company, let's say, it's also important to figure out how that purpose then influences company culture, for example. So how does having a clear mission and a clear purpose influence company culture, decision making, for example?
I think it's huge. I think it's really about authenticity. I think it's the most critical thing. If you have a purpose, and that's a purpose that is expressed through the organization, I think it helps build trust with your employees. It helps build a sense of belief in that organization and therefore loyalty. And ultimately, do we not want to build organizations where employees want to stay at that organization for a long, long time and be part of a wider mission? Otherwise, every interaction becomes transactional. And I think that's what purpose does. It brings us back to the deeper why and changes the relationship to one of a shared mission versus a transactional interaction.
Adam Penny and Claudia Biçen from The Beautiful Truth, thank you for joining us live on The Briefing. Finally today, as this year's edition of WEF starts to wind down, we wanted to check in with Monocle's contributing editor Jessica Bridger, who's been trotting up and down the Promenade for the past week, popping in and out of panel discussions. Jessica, it's great to have you join us here in the Monocle studio. How are you?
It is great to join you, and I am doing quite well. It is finally snowing.
I know, it's almost like the city, the town itself is ready for us to leave and return back to its usual self.
And realize the promise of the climate it's supposed to have rather than the one it's had for the last few weeks up here. It's been too sunny and too warm and too dry.
Well, let's dive in into some of the discussions. Hopefully they weren't as dry as the climate. You've been popping in and out of several of the houses and kind of checking out what's been happening in the open forum, so the public-facing side of the whole event. What are your key takeaways or rather the impressions? What has stayed with you from this year's edition?
My key takeaways this year have been that the houses that have more broad thematic content have had much better responses, much better people, much better feeling of we're actually trying to tackle issues. We're trying to address real problems. We're trying to have a dialogue than the houses that are more geared toward a single company or a single mission, which has been an interesting thing to see because that isn't always the case, right? A big thing at Davos has often been talking about the relationship between the private sector and the public sector. So sometimes the private sector has really interesting solutions to bring, but this year in the Promenade, things seem a little quieter. And a lot of the private sector that we're seeing are totally closed houses. So there's nothing to offer there as far as an open forum goes. And a lot of things that have to do with tech and AI. We've seen the return this year of a lot of crypto. And it's kind of an embrace of technology, which in some cases has been quite echo chamber and quite inward focused. But in other cases, such as Project Liberty, has been much more a broad discussion about what is this technological reality that we're facing? What can we take away from it? Being critical about data. There was also a panel over at CNBC about that. And we're seeing a lot of criticality in these panels about kind of the broad brush that we're also seeing on the Promenade. So it's an interesting contrast.
And you mentioned there how quieter it has seemed on the Promenade. And one of the most evident ways of figuring out how clear that is the lack of, for example, helicopter movements. It's been so much quieter, literally, this time around. What is your impression? Is Davos losing its appeal, or are people just staying inside the Congress Center more? Because it still has fulfilled the 3,000 capacity participants that it has. There are people out and about. So where did everyone go?
It seems to be that there's a lot less of the kind of hangers-on, late joiners, on the one hand. And on the other hand, you're right, we are missing some of the helicopter movements. We are missing some of the higher profile guests, as has been reported by various news outlets. So I think a lot of people are wondering, well, where is everyone this year? Is it the inauguration in the United States? That maybe is a small share. Is it changes to the structure of the participation in WEF of the entourages that we typically see up here? We're also seeing, just anecdotally, that there seem to be far more empty apartments in Davos with the shutters down. Now, is that finally the people of Davos have said, you know what, I'm tired of renting out my place. I don't want to participate in this circus? Or is it more that there just wasn't the demand and the prices are too high for a lot of people who actually would love to be up here?
Now, before I let you go, Jessica, because I know you are keen to hit the ski slopes this afternoon, one of the things that you and I have in common is that we follow urbanism issues, and you're often a regular voice on the Urbanist podcast. And we were commenting how this year also has seen kind of a decrease in the amount of city-specific panels, even city-specific presence in the Promenade. There is no house, at least that I could see, of a city. And I wonder if that has happened because WEF has this need to scale up and to tackle things on a more national, global level, or are we simply losing sight of just how much can be achieved in the local context?
I think it's more that we're losing sight of what cities and what the built environment has to offer and what we can situate there, right? There's been a certain placelessness to a lot of what I've seen. So whether that's solutions that we roll out at the national level or at the local level, regardless, we've seen a lot of people saying, I have a green solution for this, or I have an AI-based analytics solution for that. But it's not based or situated in a given place, which makes it very difficult to understand, okay, how do you apply, for example, your green wall in Singapore versus in Boston? Those are very different climates. Those are very different applications. And situating things in urban environments or in the built environment more broadly, whether that's rural or a megacity, is something that would offer maybe a chance for public and private sector to do projects and come together in a way that's also legible by a lot of the crowd here, and furthermore by a lot of the news coverage that's then put out, which makes WEF itself broadly understandable to the public, which is actually one of the worst things that I think happens at WEF, is that it can seem very isolated from reality, but actually, a lot of the people who are here, so many stakeholders, do want to impact the urban environment, do want to impact the world that we all live in. And that is vital and very important. So it would be nice to see more content that does deal with actual places, with solutions, with the way that things that are grand ideas hit the ground in a given place. That is immense power.
Monocle's Jessica Bridger there. Thank you for joining us. And that's all for this special edition of The Briefing, live from the World Economic Forum. It was produced by myself and Desiree Banley here in Davos. Our studio manager back in London was Elliot Greenfield. The Briefing is back in Zurich tomorrow at the same time as we wrap up our coverage from Switzerland this week. I'm Carlota Rebelo. Goodbye and thanks for listening.